Hello, and welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable, the only podcast that dares to be both on topic and on location, whether physical or virtual. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I'm a part of the Gestalt IT family. I focus on a variety of technologies, and I've invited a group of IT luminaries to join us today to debate a topic, actually a premise related to security. And I hope that we're going to come up with a really interesting discussion here. But I'd like to take a few moments for the guests today to introduce themselves so that you know who they are before we get into today's premise. So, Pieter-Jan.
Hey all, my name is Pieter-Jan Nefkens. You can find me on Twitter with @pjnef or on my blog site nefkens.net.
Jens.
Hi, I'm Jens Soeldner. You can find me on Twitter at Jens Soeldner, JENS SOELDNER, and I do blog at www.cloudadvisors.net.
All right. And Christopher.
Hi, my name is Christopher Kusek, and I'm CXI on Twitter, and I blog at thepragmatictech.com.
All right. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into this episode's premise. Bugs are a way of life when you are dealing with software. You didn't intend to code that variable the way that you did, and suddenly it's vulnerable to something like a buffer overflow attack. In the old days, we had to find out about these things the hard way. Hopefully, we caught them before they went to production, but the odds are good that a hacker probably found it first, and now we're making the news. Companies in recent years have decided to turn the tables, though. They have started offering bug bounty programs, which pay offensive people to find a bug and disclose it to the company for a set amount of money rather than releasing it online for other money that may be of dubious nature. And they seem to work really well, but they have created a very interesting community that is determined to make their living finding bugs in your stuff. However, I believe that it's not exactly the way we should be doing things. So the premise of this episode is that bug bounty programs are just legalized bribery. Now, I'm sure that all of you are racing for the comments right now to tell me that I am wrong and that you are crazy, but let's develop this idea. And so, Jens, you have done a lot of work in the security research field. And I'm going to start with you. Bug bounty programs have changed the way that we look at finding bugs in software. How does that look from your perspective?
Well, Tom, I would agree that bug bounty programs are definitely a good idea as long as they are run by the organization that is responsible for these bugs themselves, like Google, Microsoft, VMware, and stuff. Taking up your premise here, I do agree that the situation becomes a little bit more difficult if some random third party decides to start a bug bounty program related to other vendors. And this third party is not like a state actor that might have a good goal in mind and hopefully help these software companies by disclosing these issues. So I really do see the point that, this could be called bribery. I would say I do agree with the premise.
Yeah, that's one of the very sticky wickets that we come into is it's great if Google's paying me to find bugs in Google software, but what if Google starts paying me to find bugs in Amazon software? That becomes a bounty program of a completely different kind. And yeah, would I take that money? Well, I might not, but I'm sure there's somebody that will. So, it becomes a very catchy thing to worry about. Peter, what are your thoughts? Is bug bounty just the way that we do things now, or is this kind of changing the way that we do research into security bugs?
I think it has always been a good idea to have these bounty programs because you take the external community, look at open source communities, to actually validate your code, and if there are issues with them, you can share them, and that you get paid for your efforts. That might sound like a good idea, and I think it actually is, as long as you keep it ethical. And what has happened is that these bounty programs, or push for bounty programs even, they have created companies that make a living out of finding these bugs. And then you're going to create a market for it. And as soon as something is becoming a market instead of ethical, you get this situation where you can consider it to be bribery. So taking your example from Google, if Google pays me to find a bug in Amazon, depending on what Google wants to do with it. If Google is very transparent on it and says, hey, we're going to share that with Amazon because we love good competition in a good competitive market, sure, then it's fine. But as soon as Google is taking that for their own advantage and taking out a competitor, it's a different thing. And then you might actually get into that bribery or other verbs for that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that you really have to be cautious about. Is part of the reason bug bounty programs were created in the first place was to kind of undercut the illegal zero-day exploit market, where a good 0 day for something like, I don't know, like an Apple iPhone could go for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. And so by Apple creating a bug bounty program that said, hey, you can sell those back to us for $10,000, but we won't sue you if you find it. It has created a different market. But then let's just say that Samsung says, well, we'll pay you $12,000 for Apple's bugs. Now you've created a market, and now people are like, well, if I can get 12 from Samsung, could I get 15 from LG? And so now you're creating a problem where it's an escalating arms race. But so Christopher, go ahead, Peter.
Is that the case? Because then you're not being waived again from hacking a protected system. Because you're not having that agreement from the vendor that you're actually hacking into that system. Because it's a third party that's giving you money to hack. But you're still invading copyrights of a different vendor, and you don't have that waiver.
You're right. But there are also people who don't have that waiver when they first start. And we'll actually get into that in the next topic, but I want to get Christopher's thoughts on this.
Well, I've got many thoughts on this. So one way I like to look at it is this created, has the bug bounty type of program created a marketplace? No. Did that marketplace already exist in the first place? Yes. Did it make it where there's some protection mechanisms like Peter and Jans have referenced? Absolutely. It makes it a lot more accessible and open for people to actually be able to go and discover these things. So while we originally had an ecosystem of criminals who were going and discovering and finding problems and going and exploiting those problems, it expanded it into people who are not criminals who want to be able to leverage their knowledge, skills, and expertise. And then Peter referenced the open source community on this. And I like that actually touches really close to the heart of one of the biggest challenges I see on this is Apple saying, hey, we're going to pay you to find a problem we have. Okay, cool. And then someone finds that problem, they fix it. But then the open source community is like, hey, goodwill, please find our problems. And then the bash vulnerability that lived in source code for 20 years that everyone had access to was finally discovered. Maybe if they offer like, a cookie, maybe we would have discovered the bash vulnerability and numerous other vulnerabilities that have literally lived in an open source code base for decades. So I think the bug bounty programs themselves are taking a lot of people who might be doing their acts for criminal type activities and actually bring them into the light and bring them towards a lighter colored hat so they can actually make a professional living out of this and provide a good service back to the community as opposed to working under their evil dark lords who are paying them pennies basically.
You're trying to say that criminals don't pay well?
Not if you get paid a lot better if you're freelance. But the larger part where you become under a government state type actor, you're getting paid for gruel basically, and it's not nearly as rewarding as the freelance people. Although they have some protections until they throw you under the cover, but that covers a whole separate government actor type of attack program. We're probably not going to dig into on this call.
Well, I actually want to dance around that topic real quick because it's actually something that is kind of fascinating when you think about it. There are multiple different ways to approach this from a perspective of someone who's looking to cash in on the program. You can contact the company ahead of time and tell them that you're working on it, and they will give you certain access and certain indemnifications. If you poke around and you break something you're not supposed to, we won't hold you legally liable. However, there are people who are basically, think of them in almost like an Old West posse kind of thing. We're just going to go grab a whole bunch of wanted posters off of the post office wall, and we're going to go looking for people. And we're going to drag them back into town, and we're going to tell you need to pay up because we found the guy. But sometimes companies don't really appreciate help in that way, where people are digging around in systems unbeknownst to the company and finding things. So that can create some antagonistic relationships with companies where a person with good intentions could bring a bug to the attention of a company. Let's just say it's Microsoft. And Microsoft could say, well, you didn't follow the process to find the bug. We don't want you to disclose it. And we're not going to pay you because you didn't follow the rules. And now the person is kind of tied up. I can't tell anybody else about it. I'm not getting paid. Why shouldn't I release it to the community anonymously and get my money?
Well, I actually want to touch on how some type of like unilateral or cross-topic type things can happen. I was back when we could be in person. Last year, a team out of Taiwan had found a vulnerability in Fortinet's VPN, and at the same, hey, we found this vulnerability, and then they found that a similar type vulnerability existed in like half a dozen other VPN vendors. I think they presented on like 2 or 3, but the majority of them were vulnerable to the where, you know, they disclosed all this stuff, then CVE started being published one after the other over many months, but they initially disclosed it to the companies, and to that point, we have an agreement with one particular company of how we address this, but then we find that this problem is present across multiple vendors. Then you have to reach out to each of those vendors and like, we'd like to disclose this, but we'd also like to get paid because we're professionals doing our work. And that I don't generally support people doing things, you know, with acts of malice. And if like, you don't give me money, we're gonna rake you over the coals. But these also are professionals who are trying to make a living doing what they're doing. And if you want them to, you know, just go and be admin jockeys or something along those lines, and, you know, not pay for, you know, their efforts, it's a wicked line to cross. And I've seen when organizations try to be that, well, I'm not going to pay for anything. They're not very rewarding organizations to be working with in general, and usually tend to be more vulnerable anyway.
Jens, what do you think about that? Is it a situation where there's very real possibility that companies refusing to pay up on their bounty programs for technicalities can create the kind of thing they're trying to stop?
Yeah, definitely. I've been thinking about the problem for a couple of minutes now, and it's really like not so much a technical issue, but rather a philosophical or law issue in this relatively new field. So I wonder how this field could evolve so that there are certain rules of play and so on. So yeah, good question. How to approach it.
Yeah, I actually want to reference something kind of from a physical security perspective. I read an autobiography of a Navy SEAL many years ago who did physical penetration testing for military bases. And in order to prevent the kinds of problems that we're talking about here, they had extremely clear rules about what was and wasn't allowed. And the targets were aware that they were going to be penetrated in a certain time frame. They were aware that they were going to be attacked even in certain locations. And beyond that, the SEAL team that was attempting the penetration test was essentially given free rein to do whatever they wanted. And so they could use social engineering, they could use a variety of technology aspects to get past it. And yet it still ended up in hurt feelings when the report came back that, yes, you were vulnerable. And the team was like, we did X, Y, and Z. Well, we didn't expect you to do X. You didn't tell us we couldn't. And so it's not unlike what we get with physical penetration testing now, except how do you lay out those rules when you're effectively asserting to people, well, our code may have some bugs, but we're pretty sure it's solid. And then someone like say that the group that was doing the work for Apple in the third and fourth quarter of 2020, they found some pretty hair-raising bugs and sat on them, of course, because they were working hand in fist with Apple. But the rules said, do we avoid the login? Do we not avoid the login? Are you only allowed to test this very certain aspect of the feature because we think that the rest of it's pretty secure? What happens if I find a bug that I wasn't looking for? If the rules of engagement said I wasn't supposed to look there, but I found it, do I still get paid? It's a very sticky wicket. And how do we get around that, Peter?
I think that the parallel with the SEALs is the same as what I wanted to talk with red team, blue teaming with offensive cybersecurity. You need to have those rules of engagement, and you should follow them. And if you find caveats or bugs or weaknesses in the security that you can leverage, but you're not allowed with the rules of engagement, I would suggest to put that in a report like, hey, look, it's not part of our rules of engagement, but we came across this. And whatever you find suitable to pay for me for that, I'm okay with that, because I didn't follow that rule strictly. I just found it by accident. And it's my ethical code of conduct as an ethical hacker. I'm not certified ethical hacker, but I should be in this way, or thinking in this way, to say I found this by accident because I was testing this or this conform the rules of engagement. And I'm going to give you this vulnerability for you, and I just hope you're going to fix it.
Yeah.
But I'm taking a moral standpoint here. I understand that.
Well, altruism is alive and well, provided it pays well enough. So that's one of the problems that we're running into.
That's the key thing. And as soon as you're not doing this on an ethical thing and just going for the money, you create these organizations that pay a lot of money to get vulnerabilities, and they're not going to share that with the original manufacturer, or they're going to sell it to governments, or in a very unopen, secretive way, so that those state actors can actually bypass rules too. And that's something that triggers me to be more on the integrity on this.
Well, let's contrast that to the governments who are actively recruiting, looking for that type of work, and then looking to purchase those vulnerabilities. When we think of, what was it, Windows 7, and when 2008 R2 went end of support earlier this year, and on the day that they went end of support, the NSA released, hey, we've been sitting on this vulnerability forever, and here you go. So now it's fixed.
I know, and that's actually where I personally find it bad that these government agencies, and there are more than only the NSA, of course, there are many of them, that they actually keep on the vulnerabilities just to make sure that they can get access to other countries, which basically means they're going to put the generic public at risk too, because they're not disclosing the vulnerabilities to the vendors. And I think that's actually a bad practice.
Actually, I want to dive into that for a second. What happens when a company has a bug bounty program and a hacker or a person who is an enterprising person finds the bug, company discloses the bug, and a government who has been using the bug as an intelligence gathering tool squashes it and says, you can't fix this? I mean, it's a deeper discussion, but is the company then liable to still pay the person because they did find the bug? Closing the bug and fixing the problem is not part of the bounty program. All you paid me to do was get a hold of it.
Yep. That's a very tough decision to make.
Well, it's like you had referenced earlier, it's the wanted poster approach. My job is to find the criminal, find the actor, whatever it is. Whatever you do with it, that's on you. But their job as the hunters is to find these people, and it is what it is.
True, but if you take that parallel and suppose you find that vulnerability that's being misused, it's if you take a parallel with the wanted and you find a serial killer, a psycho, and you give them to the authorities or to the company, and then you expect that company to take action and not to let that person loose. And it's the same principle with the vulnerability. So you found this big vulnerability, which can be exploited, and it's not going to be fixed for whatever mysterious reason. Are you going to accept that or not?
Well, I mean, it's kind of you disclose it to them, and then because we've seen that happen in the past where a vulnerability was disclosed, and then the company sat on it, and the original disclosure said, all right, well, we've been waiting for the CVE to be published. No CVE is published. What was it? The Intel vulnerabilities actually went on that, and they said, you know what, we're going to publish this information because they're still sitting on this. And then it went wide stream across the entire space. Remind me which ones those were, because
Spectre and Meltdown.
Yeah, there are too many Intel bugs at the moment.
But actually, let's take a moment to talk about that. So what happens when you get into a situation where you report a bug and a company sits on it, and maybe the agreement is they'll pay out when they disclose it? Is it your right to say, I need more money to sit on this? Is it your right to basically, well, I don't want to use the word extortion because that's illegal, but can you negotiate? And what happens when a company says, well, that wasn't a big enough bug for us to pay out? Because that's happened in the past too. Finding a code execution vulnerability in a CPU register that allows for multi-tenancy, that's not important. We're not going to pay you the 10 grand that we promised. By the way, don't ever tell anybody that you found this.
Well, you can always negotiate, but unless they have you on a strict NDA, usually because they paid you money, that they're saying you cannot go and disclose this, you cannot go and share this, then it becomes whoever is going to be in breach of contract on their particular side. If they don't have any clear terms, I mean, basically, it's a contract, right? You're working off the rules of the contract, and the rules start to get a little wavy when you're dealing with international partners and international players on this. But when we're looking at like strictly from a U.S. person finding U.S. problem and contacting the company, you got to follow your contract law. But then once the borders open, hey, it's kind of it becomes the Wild West, which the entire a large portion of the bug bounty space kind of is the Wild West, and the wanted poster and people actually going and hunting, that is more applicable than it is trying to treat it as a formal program that has formal rules, because we're not there. We're definitely not there.
So what I'm interpreting from what you're saying with the Wild West is that the bug bounty program should actually become more mature and more of a commercial market. And with that, clearer rules of engagement, clearer rules on when to disclose or not to disclose, and allowing to disclose if the company is not fixing it, because that's part of that maturity too.
So let's take that thought to the logical extreme then. So why should it be the company that's responsible for paying the bug bounty hunters to do this? Why can't we have some sort of bug bounty hunters guild where you register with the guild, you take the bug bounty, the guild gets the money from the company and pays you, and you don't have to worry about negotiating with the company as to whether or not they're going to pay out. I mean, it works in every D&D game and Star Wars series that I've ever seen. It should work here.
So there's a simple approach to this. Is if we take it out of the hands of the individual companies and we try to open it up to be more of an open standard, it becomes an insurance problem, because a lot of these people see this as an insurance problem, at which point we hand this over to EYC or any of these large insurance carrier organizations, and the companies will pay for their bug bounty insurance. And then when there's a problem and then there's a discovery and disclosure, then there's a payout. And then that actually expands the entire space exponentially to where lots of insurance companies are making money, and the bug bounty hunters are making a little bit, and the criminals are just doing what they're doing anyway. And they're like, oh, well, yeah, I'll offer you a little bit more because, oh, we'll buy insurance on that also. And I feel like it actually makes the problem far, far worse in a very scary but very profitable way for the people who are trying to monopolize upon it.
Yeah, I think that having a third party kind of take that on does have a lot of insurance problems, but it also has a lot of culpability problems as well. And it gets away from Google calling a bounty on Amazon, but we may not know who put out the bounty whenever we start signing up for it, and we may find ourselves doing something we probably shouldn't have, and that comes back to a liability problem. Is the guild going to protect you from liability? And, we hope they do, but there's every possibility in the current situation that a company may think that they found a bug so bad that they never want you to talk about it. And if you do breach a contract or not, they could very well sue you. And then you're kind of out of luck. So.
Well, I don't want to keep talking, but I do want to at least touch on that opens the door to liability of remediation at that point. Because if you're ensuring the people who are finding the bugs and ensuring the process around the bugs, then those people who aren't actually remediating and resolving the bugs and the problems that live within the system once something's resolved or a patch is released, then it just expands. Again, it'll be a very rich insurance marketplace, but it'll be I don't think it's going to make all of us better by throwing more bureaucracy and rules against it. Regulation solves all problems, I'm pretty sure.
It creates other problems too with regulations, because it's always difficult to put them crystal clear in a single interpreted way. I mean, just look at how standards are being interpreted, or RFCs. that guild thing, isn't that already happening with a couple of open source projects or community projects to find bounties, and the loot is basically shared? But I think it's the responsibility of the organization providing code of a specific quality, and I think that they should actually pay out for those bugs, because otherwise they will be liable for a much larger number of companies that can hold that original vendor liable for not providing proper code. And we have a legislation here in Europe, and that's that we need to do anything possible to prevent data loss. And recently, even an IT support company was made co-liable because it didn't consult the proper ways in security. And with that paradigm, you could actually take that a step further, that if there's a vulnerability and that vulnerability was known for a number of years and the software company, Microsoft, for example, hasn't solved that, then Microsoft is co-liable for that data loss. It has enabled the data loss, and therefore 10% of the gross revenue in fines. And that's quite a bit.
Chiming in with Peter here, I really have the strong feeling this is less of a technical problem for IT security experts. It's, in my opinion, something that needs to be delegated to lawmakers and law specialists that change the rules of engagement here from a top-down perspective. If you just leave the rest to the market, I'm not sure from my German perspective if that's really helping. I would really delegate it to law specialists and people who have a strong background in these fields. That's my feeling, at least.
Yes, or industry-wide guidelines that everybody follows, like the Wi-Fi 6 Alliance, with most of the Wi-Fi vendors in there.
But that's a technical thing again.
Yes.
Like standardization is a good thing, I agree. But in such a case, the problems that Tom has shed light upon, I'm not sure if pure technical standardization can solve the problem, as long as some people are just not playing along.
I think maybe we should, if we get governments involved, we get regulation involved, we get it from lawmakers involved, then we can officially put on the record bringing back the original Microsoft monopoly case, because Microsoft owns GitHub. Microsoft has a monopoly on exploits and bugs and code. So therefore, we should hold Microsoft fully accountable for all of the problems that live in the world, because they're all going to be living inside of GitHub, right?
I think maybe that's a good place to wrap it here is we look at bug bounty programs as a purely technical solution to a problem that's created by technology, when in fact, the legality around everything is much more nuanced and is not going to be solved with code or agreements in place that are not enforceable by some kind of legal action, because by its very nature, disclosing the bug without the permission of the company is an illegal act. Trying to seek money to get paid for it on the black market is an illegal act. It's extortion. And so it's going to come back into the courts sooner or later anyway. And I guess ultimately the problem that we need to consider is, should we be paying people at all? And if we do, what kind of agreements do we need to have in place to make sure that the process is as transparent as possible, so that we don't end up with the Wild West of posses collecting wanted posters and maybe bringing in the wrong person? But that's an entirely different discussion that will probably have to wait for another day. I want to thank our guests for joining us today and being a part of the On-Premise IT Roundtable. If you want to check out the latest episode of this podcast, please head over to our website at gestaltit.com/podcast. If you want to check us out in your favorite podcast application of choice, you can do that as well. Also find us on iTunes. And if you are subscribed to us on iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. People will read those reviews and use it to decide whether or not they want to entertain the premise of our episodes. If you have a premise that you'd like us to discuss here on the podcast, please check us out on Twitter. We're at Gestalt IT. Send us a tweet with your idea, and you may see it featured in a future episode. But for now, for Tom Hollingsworth and our great guests and the rest of the Gestalt IT community, thank you for listening in, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.